Hi and welcome back to my channel. Usually when I do these wrap-up videos, I talk a little bit about what has happened since last time, but this time I won't because I'm hoping there's going to be a live stream soon. I'm not quite sure when it's going to be yet, but I'll keep you posted. So this time I'll only talk about the books, because in March I've read 12 books, which is a great month for me, so I think we'll just get into it. And the first one I finished this month is a hugely popular one, and it's Sapiens, A Brief History of Mankind by Yuval Noah Harari. This is one of those books that if you go to a Norwegian flea market, you'll probably be able to buy 50 of these, because everyone has read it and everyone wants to get rid of it, it seems. And the title pretty much says it all. It's about humankind and our history, and I think it dates back 13 billion years or something like that, and brings us up until the present. When reading this one, I've sort of felt like I knew the author, because I think everyone has had that kid in class that's never wrong about anything, and that's the feeling I had when I read it. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed the book, I found it interesting, but let's just say it's not a whole lot of nuances, I feel. It's already a big book and you can't really write it without taking some shortcuts, I feel, and I felt that was quite apparent when reading it. Several times during this read I found myself thinking, could this information be correct, because it seems a bit easy, and then time goes by and I'm too lazy to check up on it. Also, if I was going to check up on everything I was wondering about in this novel, I wouldn't have read any other book this month, so. At the same time, I found it interesting thinking about things in a bigger picture, even though I felt like he was kind of a cheap philosopher. And as I understand, many people have talked about him being a lot of things, but a philosopher isn't one of them. The next thing might be unavoidable, but I felt like the things you know a little bit about he explains in too great of detail, but then the things you have no clue about is perfectly explained, so it might just be that you're fed up with getting information you think you know from before once more. I don't know what else to say. I found this to be an enjoyable read, not too exciting, not too dull. I will probably not read the sequel just yet, but I feel like everyone else has. My next read was The Summer Book by Tove Jansson, so the author famous for the Moomin characters, and this is about a grandmother and a grandchild at this summer place. Each chapter is sort of a thing they did together. And it seems like the goal of this chapter is so that we can get to know these two and their relationship. As you might expect, this is a very easily read novel, but it has no storyline, and at times it felt more like I was reading a memoir rather than a story about these two, which annoyed me a bit. To be honest, it completely lost me, because if you're not interested in their relationship together, there's no story for you, and I thought there would be some kind of plot, something that drove this story forward, but you sort of have to fall in love with these two and their time being spent together. It didn't really help that these two characters are quite cool on their own, because together they're not. And I know what feeling this book wants to give me, but it didn't. I also know that some people would absolutely love this novel, because if this one hits you right, it really does, I think. So, just not me. And now for a book that has been warming my shelf for over 2 years, and that's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck by Mark Manson. So this is a real self-helpy book set out to make people feel better about themselves by not giving a fuck. This one has a very straightforward language, and it sort of feels like the cool hip American Big Brother is going to teach you stuff. At least that's what I felt. This one was more fun than educational to me. He says fuck positivity, it's all going to hell, just live with it, and I'm not the most optimistic or positive person alive, so to me maybe this was just obvious. It has sold more than 3 million copies, so I guess that a lot of people felt like this was useful. I actually didn't feel like I learned anything. That being said, I enjoyed reading this, and to me it was sort of a reminder that I could think a little bit more positive. If nothing else, I could think more positive thoughts around me being negative. And we're not going to become positive just yet, because the next novel is Two Sisters by Åsne Seierstad. This one I wanted to read because I read The Bookseller of Kabul earlier, which I loved, also by Åsne Seierstad. And the topic of this book has been in the news a lot the last years. It's about two sisters, 16 and 19 years old, traveling from Norway to join ISIS. This basically tells the story of their radicalization, but also of the family that's left behind. So these two left Norway about 10 years ago, and they actually returned to Norway 2 weeks after I finished reading it. So that was kind of a surprise to me and the rest of the Norwegian public. Yeah, just a bit weird. I think the people that have read this book has about 0% sympathy with what they did. I think maybe when I started out reading this one, I had some sort of sympathy for them, but after a while that disappeared. But they were young when they left, and maybe they didn't know what they were up to. There could have been a lot of things that we don't know, but at least throughout that book, it just didn't seem like they had regrets at all, which I found to be strange, but maybe that's how it is. As with the last book I read from her, it feels like it's very well researched. Also, it's pretty straightforward, so there's not a lot of characterization of people. It's more just presenting what has happened, and I find that to be reassuring. It's more like she's just presenting facts and trying to deliver the story. And the story really is enough on its own, because it's heart-wrenching. Especially with the father left back in Norway trying to find his daughters. He travels down to the Middle East and he experiences a lot of pain, both physically and mentally, and it's just hard to read about. I think that describes this book. It's horrible, but it's well written. Then over to one of those books that I've been calling a fan favorite, because earlier this year I made a video about 6 books that I was going to read that you guys recommended to me. And the first one out is Buddenbrooks by Thomas Mann, The Decline of a Family. This is the one book that gave Thomas Mann the Nobel Prize for Literature, and obviously that's one reason why you might want to read a book. It's about 4 generations of this German upper-class family that trades goods. And obviously how things aren't that great and keeps on getting worse. Like every other classic, this one also has too many names in the beginning of it, but I've just started looking up the names from beforehand and just having them in my pocket looking at them when I'm confused. And since this one is about a rich family, so many characters also has the same first name, which is annoying. In the beginning of it, the first few generations move a bit swiftly, so you get to know the main generation, and that sort of helps, just keeping it a bit more tidy when it comes to all the characters. There's also something to be said about a novel where you see the children grow up. You sort of feel like you know them a lot more than the older generations, and thus they mean more to you when reading about them. Without me being able to pinpoint it exactly, it felt more modern than the age of the novel might suggest. This might have something to do with Thomas Mann being very young when writing this, but also there are a lot of moments where nothing really happens, but it was just described how nothing happened, and it was really interesting. Especially this one scene where this kid plays piano, and he plays piano for like 10 pages. And at the beginning I was sort of wondering, what am I actually reading? But at the end I had this feeling of having read something important. It's very hard to describe, and I'm not the best at this, but I think what I'm trying to say is that if I read those things in other novels, I think I would have been bored, but I wasn't reading this one. If someone could explain to me what I'm talking about, please comment below. Besides having a language that made me intrigued, it is a very slow novel and it's a long one, so there's a lot of ups and downs, but I felt like the moments where they tried to create tension, it worked really well. But there are a lot of things to write about that aren't all that interesting. And I think the topic that interested me the most in this one is when they talked about the business side of things. So who did the family and the Germans trade with? Who did they not trade with? What were things costing those days? And how did things work? I found that topic to be enjoyable, and also it's a part of what went wrong with the family, so obviously it has some tension to it. The thing I didn't enjoy reading about, and usually don't enjoy reading about, is people getting married to people they don't want to get married to and all that jazz. So in that sense, it's a classic. It's also a classic in the sense that no real major events happened that led to the downfall of this family. There were just a bunch of smaller events, which I found to be a bit underwhelming at times and a bit slow. All in all, I'm glad I read this one. If it's one thing that didn't scare me, it was the language, and that gives me hope for his other works. And now for one I knew I would enjoy, and that is A Man Called Ove by Fredrik Backman. So this author is one that is easily one of my favorites, and I watched the movie for this one a couple of years ago, before I knew about the author, and I decided to read the book and then watch the movie again. So I made a separate video about this last month, and let's just say I was surprised, so you might want to check out that one if you're interested. Ove is an old grumpy man and he really just wants to die, but people won't let him because they keep on dragging him into their lives, and what do you know? Ove isn't all that bad maybe, and he has a past. The thing about this one is that it's so simplistic in its form, but just in the way that Fredrik Backman writes, it's sad, it's humorous, it's all feelings combined at the same time, and the more you read, the more you start caring for the main character, and the character development in this one is the thing that makes this great, I would say. Is the story believable? No. Could it have happened? I don't think so, but I loved it anyway, and well, it's hard talking about a book that you absolutely loved. Like, it's not often that I read books and think, well, how could I live without it? But this is one of those, and that has happened before with Fredrik Backman, so it feels kind of weird at this point. I'm not used to having such strong feelings towards an author or a book, but I do with this one and those of his. I talk more about it in the other video that I mentioned, but in short, this is just perfect. The next one is also one that I made a separate video about this month, and that is Odin's Child by Sigrid Pettersen. This is a YA fantasy novel in this Viking-esque environment, I guess. And it's about this girl called Hirka. She has no tail, and this is very strange because everyone in this society has one. She was found by this man when she was a baby, and he discovered that she didn't have a tail, so he basically put a knife into her back and made it look like a wolf had eaten it. And let's just say that Hirka is now praying for no one to notice that she's never really had a tail, because if she didn't have a tail, people think they could rot by touching her, for example. Since this book starts out with this man finding this small baby and putting a knife into a baby's back and sort of turning it a lot to make it look like a wolf has eaten a tail, it's a very, what is the word? Grotesque, intense beginning, and I sort of like novels that do this, throws you into something quite intense to spark some engagement, and that works for me. I know that not everyone enjoys this method, but I think it's great because I'm easily distracted, so if something just grabs hold of me at once, that's sort of a good deal. But after those intense scenes, there's a lot of things just thrown in there that you're wondering, should I know this? Have I forgotten something? Have I not paid attention? Because it seems like the author is really satisfied with her own world building, and she's leading up to a lot of stuff that makes me kind of insecure as a reader. But after the first half, things got a lot clearer, and I knew why she did the stuff she did, but it was a bit too much for my sake. There could have been more things just plainly thrown out there and explained. Also, something that bugs me generally when reading fantasy is the knowledge of distance. So when Hirka walks somewhere, I have no idea how far it is, and I wish I had more information, but it's not easy writing a novel where you explain how far someone walks or how much time they spent walking. It's easier just cutting it out, but I would like to know. And it's important for me when I read books like these that I have clear mental pictures of how things look, and this really gave me those pictures, so I'm happy. I liked Hirka as our main protagonist, and she also has a lot of cool people around her, and their chemistry is one of the things that I truly enjoyed. I also talk more about this one in the other video, but in short, I found the beginning to be very cool, then it got a bit slow, but it really picked up the pace after a while. And this is a part of a trilogy, so I'm definitely going to read the other 2 books. And now over to this month's first 1 star, and that's The Alchemist by Paolo Coelho. So I heard about this author from a podcast several times over the years. I listened to this podcast from about 7 years ago and up until now, and they sort of make fun of Paolo Coelho quite often. They use him as an example of an author you might read if you don't read books, and I get it. In short, this is about a young shepherd that sets out to find a treasure in the Egyptian pyramids, but he finds out the meaning of life and himself, and it's hard even talking about this one. I'll start off by saying that I immediately gave this a 1 star on my Goodreads after I finished reading it, and it's my most popular review on Goodreads ever. In a short period of time, I got 2 likes on my review without having written anything at all. Just the fact that I gave it 1 star was enough for people to enjoy my review, which made me sort of happy. I felt like it was sort of a community in itself. The whole thing starts out with a Bible quote, and I thought to myself, is it really allowed to have a Bible quote in the beginning of such a short novel? I get it if you're Dostoevsky or write books like at least 500 pages, but this? No. But what I realized was that Paolo Coelho is from Brazil, and I don't think I've read any other authors from Brazil. And of course, one of my goals for this year is to read 5 new countries, and maybe this is one of them. In that case, it's a huge win. And several times while I read this one, I actually laughed out loud because things are ridiculous. I'll end talking about this book by giving you the top 3 most liked quotes from Goodreads from this novel. And it's sort of like, if you get it, you get it. And if you don't, you don't, I think. So the first one is, and when you want something, all the universe conspires in helping you to achieve it. So that's the most popular quote from this novel. The second one is, it's the possibility of having a dream come true that makes life interesting. And the third one is, when we love, we always strive to become better than we are. When we strive to become better than we are, everything around us becomes better too. Please just stop. And now for something more confusing, and it's Agnes Ravatn, and the book is The Bird Tribunal. So this author has been on my radar for a long time, and I actually purchased this novel about a year ago, 2 years ago, something along those lines. It's about this woman that has recently left her husband to travel into this fjord where this man lives, and she's helping him out with making food and like tidying up the place. And in short, it's about those two at his place talking and not talking to each other. He is very strange, she is very strange, and it's all a bit strange. And I really didn't have any expectations going into this. I just thought it would be kind of complicated because it seems like one of those books. Just look at this cover. It doesn't scream simplicity, I feel. And this is a mystery slash thriller, I guess. And it's the first novel that I've ever read where I felt like it would have helped me to know the genre of this novel before I started reading it. Because at times it was sort of like, okay, if this is supposed to be scary, I get why it's scary. But since I don't know that it's supposed to be scary, it's just more weird. At least if I knew this was a thriller, I would be afraid for her life the whole way through. And instead, I just find them both a bit special. Have you ever read a book where the lack of your knowledge about the book has destroyed it a bit? Please comment below if you have. Or if you haven't, I'm always glad when someone comments my videos. Summed up, this really isn't my cup of tea. It has no real plot and it's a slow one. I like the language, I like how it's written, and if I knew it was a mystery thriller kind of thing, I think I would enjoy it more. And now for the next not my cup of tea novel, and that is Who Killed Bambi by Monika Fagerholm. So this won the Nordic Council Literature Prize in 2020. I try to read the last 10 winners of this prize, and this one was up this month. It's about this gang rape that happens in Helsinki, Finland, and it happens in this posh neighborhood. Sort of all the posh people in this neighborhood try to cover it up, but this young man decides that he wants to make a movie about this incident, and he calls it Who Killed Bambi. I would say that this novel is kind of messy. It's hard to get a grip on what's actually happening, and I'm not the person that has the time to really think about what I read, or I should. I sometimes feel like I should because it would be very valuable. Of course, this is a novel that has gotten a lot of praise, and I guess that has to do with how the language is structured, because it's not your average novel. It's not always certain when it's talked about, or if it's the movie they're talking about, or real life, or who is who and who is responsible for what. It's very messy in my head, and I couldn't really get a grip on it. I would say that I spent most of the time just waiting for the information to come my way, for some big reveal that made me understand it, but it didn't. As I said, I'm very certain that I would have enjoyed this more if I had more time and if I had the mental capacity for it, but I don't. This being said, it reminds me somewhat of Patricia Lockwood's novel No One Is Talking About It, in sort of how it's structured and how I structure it in my head. And that one I've thought about a lot since I read it, but I did not enjoy reading it because it's messy and my head won't do messy. And my favorite part about this is how well it's discussed the different classes and how they behave towards the incident. So the actual real things that I read about and can wrap my head around, I enjoyed. So if I just wrapped my head around more of the stuff I read, it would be a plus. And now I don't have that many of the winners left to read. And now one that I waited a long time to read, and that is Hersketeknikker by Sigrid Sollund. So this is a Norwegian political program host / journalist. Hersketeknikker translates to something like... It doesn't really translate, and that's the problem. It's one of those very specific Norwegian words that's hard to define, but the closest we have come is master suppression techniques, and it's the things you do voluntarily or involuntarily to win debates or just decide over someone. This might be to ridicule someone. This has to be very voluntarily, or if you're in a debate and you constantly look over the shoulder of the person you're talking with, making that person insecure, or it could be to just withhold information or have very expressive hand gestures to control your opponent. There's a lot to discuss, and she does in this one. It's very easily accessible. She's very honest, so she talks about herself and how she uses these techniques when she deals with her children and how that makes her feel bad. Also, she has a lot of examples from the program she leads on TV or on radio, and I just wish I could see some of the clips when I read it, because the things she discusses is kind of funny at times. Also, I felt like I learned a whole lot from this one, especially when it comes to dealing with people that uses these techniques. So if you're in a meeting with someone that behaves in the way that she discusses, you have some tips and tricks on how to deal with those kind of people. Also, it makes you conscious on your own behavior, so that's both painful and insightful. In March, I've traveled a lot, and if it's one thing I enjoy about traveling, it's picking out a new book on your trip, because you run out of books. Specifically because you then have to choose a book you're in the mood for, and you can choose whatever book you like. Sort of when I stand in front of my shelf, I feel obliged to read some of them more than others, but in the store that doesn't matter that much. So the last book I read this month I bought on sale, and it has been on my Goodreads list from the beginning, but I didn't know what it was about until I read on the back of it. And that is Hver dag skal vi være så modig by Brynulf Jung Tjønn. This is not yet translated, but I wish it was. This is about Isaac. He is 10 years old and he lives alone with his mother. His mother doesn't leave their home and she's a very abusive person that guilt trips him into doing stuff and not doing stuff. And the story is given from his perspective and how he deals with all of this. Just a painful and beautiful story told through the powerful perspective of a 10-year-old. I caught myself thinking about how a grown man can write from a 10-year-old's perspectives in such a meaningful way, because I found myself thinking about how I would react as a 10-year-old in those situations, and I felt like I could relate. Somehow that doesn't make sense to me, but I thought this one was brilliant. A lot of the things that made the biggest impact is through the things that aren't really said, but rather shown to you. And this is hard to talk about without actually reading the book for you. I really hope this one will be translated because it's just a monster of a book in a very small package. So let's cross our fingers. And last but not least, I do enjoy the aesthetics of this cover, and the binding I absolutely love because it has like a tactile feel and a beautiful color, and yeah, what's not to like? So a great surprise for this month. So these were all the books, and reading 12 books in a month is just what I would call a super duper month. It's bringing me far above my reading goals, and that makes me happy. I don't know if I have a lot more to share, so if you have read any good books this month, please comment below and share your favorites, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for watching. Bye!